But for hundreds of years, Europe held on firmly to Galen's miasma theory, which said that disease and infection was actually caused by miasmas, or bad airs, which emanated from things that rotted. Miasma theory fit in with the humoral system of medicine, which theorized that your body is composed of 4 different fluids or humors: yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. And if any of these are out of balance, you can fall ill or go insane, and the humors can be put back in balance through various means. Here's where things started to fall into a vicious cycle. While despite common belief, people in the medieval period weren't afraid of washing with water, in the early modern era, the idea of water as spreading contagion through the pores picked up steam very quickly, and over time people full-body bathed with water less and less in favor of dry baths where you would rub yourself down with soap and a rough cloth. People knew that something was wrong with their water. There literally was. With the rise of factories and growing urban populations and no indoor plumbing, city waterways were rapidly becoming contaminated with waste, garbage, and other urban refuse, not to mention, decomposing bodies. People literally didn't know how germs worked, nor that they existed yet. Microscopes existed by the Victorian era, but were often waved off as being useless. So a lot of people not only washed less than would be ideal, but they also recontaminated their own drinking water, having no idea what they were doing. In 1854, Broad Street in London experienced a violent outbreak of cholera, killing over 600 people. Before this, an obstetrician named John Snow had already had the suspicion that the contagion was being spread by people drinking infected water, but nobody would listen to him. After all, the British medical community at this time was a very much bros club that didn't like being told that they're wrong about things, but we'll get to that later. Obviously, cholera is caused by evil vapors, so what the fuck is Dr. Snow talking about? Well, septic systems at this time were not fantastic, and the waste that floated into the Thames River could easily contaminate the supply of drinking water in the wells and pumps where people got their washing and drinking water from. After much experimentation, it was discovered that a mother had washed her baby's diapers and then dumped the dirty water into a cesspool a few feet from the Broad Street water pump, where everyone who had contracted cholera had gotten their water from. Did this entirely convince the medical community that miasma theory is wrong? Absolutely not. But if daily life was as dirty and rife with bacteria as this, what was the state of the hospitals? Just as bad, actually. Hospitals were so awful that the public actually dubbed them houses of death, because you were so much more likely to die being treated at a hospital than you were at home. You may have been wondering why I'm wearing a grimy, gross-looking apron right now. Well, before white coats became the doctor's uniform, surgeons wore aprons covered in blood, guts, and brains. Yeah, they just walked around like that, because they saw these nasty-ass aprons as a token of honor of sorts. No gloves, no masks, they didn't wash their hands often, and also often used the same unwashed bloody tools on multiple patients in a row. I wonder why people are getting infections all the time. Medical students, much like today, had to learn about anatomy by dissecting cadavers. These dissection rooms were disgusting, covered in blood, organs, random body parts lying around, and here's where it gets worse. Yeah, somehow it gets worse. You can probably imagine that in these conditions, the medical profession wasn't for the faint of heart. Medical schools force students to develop a sort of necessary inhumanity in order to cope emotionally with living every day dissecting and operating on both the dead and the living who, in the age before anesthesia, would scream and cry in agony during operations. Students began to see bodies as just objects, and many medical students surpassed indifference and went straight to treating corpses as props for practical jokes. They used severed arms and legs as mock weapons for sword fighting, and hid them in places where they would shock the uninitiated. This disrespect for the dead was widely despised by the public, especially because the manner in which hospitals got these bodies to study was just as inhumane. Most of these bodies weren't donated by the deceased to science, they were stolen. During and far before the Victorian era, body snatching was big business for gangs looking to make money. These grave-robbing crews, often called resurrection men or resurrectionists, would steal into graveyards in the dead of night soon after new burials and dig up the newly deceased bodies, secretly bringing them to anatomists and doctors at the university hospitals for study. These bodies were almost universally robbed from the graves of the poor, and even more more often from the graves of poor people of color. The problem was so bad that those who could spare the money would bury their loved ones beneath cages to keep the resurrection men out. The resentment of the public towards the body snatchers came to a head in New York in 1788, when, according to many versions of the tale, some boys playing in a playground near the New York hospital climbed a ladder to look into the dissection room, and one of the surgeons waved a severed arm at the boy, who became convinced that it was the arm of his recently deceased mother. The boy ran home in panic to tell his father, and the father flew into a rage, going to check his wife's coffin at the cemetery. Finding it empty, he and his friend marched down to the hospital armed with shovels and picks. Colonel William Heth recounted later, "The cry of barbarity, etc., was soon spread. The young sons of Galen fled in every direction. One took refuge in a chimney the mob raised, and the hospital apartments were ransacked. In the anatomy room were found 3 fresh bodies, one boiling in a kettle, the 2 others cutting up, with certain parts of the 2 sexes hanging up in the most brutal position. The circumstances, together with the wanton and apparent inhuman complexion of the room, exacerbated the mob beyond all bound, to the total destruction of every anatomy in the hospital." By the next day, a mob was running around the city searching for doctors, medical students, and bodies, yelling, "Bring out your doctors!" At the end of the violence, about 20 people were left dead. As if this wasn't bad enough, many dissections of these bodies were done as theatrical public viewing events. People could take a seat in the dark anatomical amphitheaters of the university hospitals and watch as renowned surgeons took them apart. Voyeurism of this sort wasn't limited to the dead. Often regular surgeries were done in these amphitheaters, on view in front of dozens of medical students and visiting doctors or donors. And in those days, anesthesia wasn't yet commonplace, so the most that patients could do during surgery was bite down on something and scream, or they were given something like alcohol, laudanum, or opium. So you can imagine that speed was essential to avoid prolonged agony, which brings me to one of the most famous surgeons of this era who, for better or for worse, was the fastest surgeon around, Robert Liston. Robert Liston, not to be confused with Joseph Lister of Listerine fame, was born October 28, 1794. Everybody clap, we're talking about another Scorpio. Now just take a minute to prepare yourself, because almost everything about this man feels like being punched in the face with information. Robert Liston was 6'2" and apparently completely shredded, like he had an unreal amount of strength. So imagine this massive, hulking strongman walking around these dirty hospitals, and he's also one of the most renowned surgeons of the time. Because not only is Liston strong as hell, he's also one of the fastest surgeons around. So much so that a colleague said, "The gleam of his knife was followed so instantly by the sound of sawing as to make the 2 actions appear simultaneous." Surgery at this time was incredibly risky. For the most part, surgeons wouldn't operate on anything in the torso because the patients would almost certainly die. Liston himself wrote at least 3 books, and one of which is a collection of his lectures, and they don't exactly endorse getting all up in the internal organs. But appendages were fair game, because it was more likely that you could control infection or else simply cut the limb off if things went south. And that's exactly what surgeons frequently did. Why do you think amputees that were running around in the Victorian era? A lot, in any case. Until December 21st, 1846, when Robert Liston performed a successful surgery using ether as an anesthetic on the patient, thus marking the beginning of its popular use but not the first use. Speed was essential in minimizing the physical suffering of patients, and Liston's speed was legend. Not only that, but he refused to use a proper tourniquet because apparently his left arm was so strong he'd just use that and clamp his big meaty claw down to stop the blood flow. I mean, really? He could reportedly remove a leg in less than 30 seconds, and held his bloody knife in between his teeth when he needed to use his hands. Surgery was bravado and theater for Liston, often entering the surgical theater and loudly shouting, "Time me, gentlemen!" Sometimes the speed was detrimental though, like in the most famous story about Liston, the surgery that had a 300% mortality rate. This story may or may not be apocryphal, but we might never know for certain. In any case, according to the story, during one of Liston's surgeries, his flailing supersonic buff arms were moving so fast, he took off 3 of his assistant's fingers, slashed the coat of a spectator, and in some versions of the story, they say it was one of his balls. The patient and the assistant died of gangrene, and the spectator died of shock on the spot. But hey, to his credit, he was one of the few surgeons at the time who actually washed his hands before operating and wore clean aprons, so you win some, you lose some. It was due to his innate sense of cleanliness that Liston had one of the lowest mortality rates of the surgeons at the time. Except, that one time. But as much as speed saved the patient from prolonged pain, Liston, like many doctors at the time, had to make some pretty mind-boggling behavioral decisions in order to save lives. In one case, a patient who needed a bladder stone removed was so terrified that he ran from the operating room and locked himself upstairs in a bathroom. Liston, obviously, chased him down, broke the door down, and forcibly dragged the man screaming back to the operating room, where he strapped him down before performing and completing the surgery in exactly 1 minute. Fastest knife in the West End. This is especially jarring considering the fact that he would also often postpone an operation if patients were too scared and said, I quote, "It is of utmost importance to attend to the state of the patient's mind and feelings. He ought not to be kept in suspense, but encouraged and assured, and his apprehensions must be allayed." I wish I understood anything about this man's mind. When the serial killing duo Williams, Burke, and Hare were going around Edinburgh killing people and supplying bodies to surgeons for pay, one of those surgeons was Robert Knox. Liston confronted Knox about this by, tackling the man to the ground. But at the same time, Liston himself employed a gang of body snatchers, so where does the good ethics begin and end here? I'm pretty sure it never actually began. In any case, Liston was an incredibly complicated man. He contributed quite a lot to the advancement of medicine, but he was also a huge, scary, weird man with an incomprehensible moral compass. Either way, I definitely had to give him his own section.